Well, first, I'd like to say thank you to CRI and also to Ong Kaur who invited me to come do this presentation. I just want to start off by saying that I'm a student of Gurbani, and I'm just here as a student sharing my own experience and my own process with translation. I don't claim to be the expert or that this is the only way to think about things, but if it's helpful for you in understanding the Guru, then I'm grateful for what I can share. Okay, so let's just jump in, and here we go. All right, so the subject that I want to share with you today is One Light, Text, Subtext, and Supertext in the translation of Gurbani. And I'm actually going to start this conversation by framing the issue of communication in general, because we can't really talk about sacred texts or sacred words or Bani without kind of first getting grounded in what communication is on a larger scale. So do you see the humans as sensory beings slide? I just want to make sure that everyone's seeing my screen.
Hanji, we can see your screen.
Okay, great. So what I want to start with is kind of a framing of what the human being is that isn't necessarily grounded in any particular philosophy. So what I want to offer is that first we have to understand ourselves as sensory beings. You know, we sense, we grow, and we grow through our senses. And we defend ourselves through our senses. And we experience this brief, momentary thing we've named life through our senses. And eventually we have to face this terrifying moment of dissolution that we've named death through our senses. And our senses are both kind of gross and subtle. You know, you have the senses of the eyes and the ears and the mouth and the nose and the tongue, you know, the sexual organs. The 9 holes, we call them, is how you sense the world. But then you also have this more refined sense, you know, what some people call the aura or the energetic field. And it really just means that your ability to sense goes beyond the limit of your physical skin. You know, if someone comes up behind you, you can feel them before they touch you. So as a human being, we have very clear senses that we can relate functions to, and then we have a more subtle energetic field that our nervous system gives us access to. And the point is that if you just look at the human being just simply as it is a being that senses. And all of us are individual and collective at the same time, all the time. And I love this example of the Pando Forest in Utah. It's 100 acres and there are close to 50,000 trees, but they're all cloned identical copies of each other. And they share one root system. So it's actually considered one living organism and the largest living organism on the earth. And it looks like a lot of individual trees, you know, above the surface, but underneath at the root, it's all connected. It's all one. So the root is one while the trees are individual. And so, you know, underneath the surface, there's a unified field of communication, shared information, shared nutrition, navigating, and then above the surface, it just looks like a bunch of trees, beautiful trees, but, you know, who knew that they're all talking to each other and sharing with each other all the time? A lot of creation myths like to posit the humans as separate from nature or above nature in the sense of being separate somehow from creation. But if we look at the human being kind of minus all the myths, we can start to understand that actually the entire earth is a living system. The earth is a place where creativity happens constantly, where destruction happens constantly. It's a massive living network of flux. Things come together to create something new. Other life dies to make way for the new. I was with my fiance recently and had this insight that I only existed in this moment and he only existed in this moment because for billions of years, creatures have been, being creative and procreating with each other on the earth. It might not be a very socially polite thing to talk about, but it's very biologically accurate. We exist because of our ancestors. And our ancestors are not only human. If we really want to get into the depth of it, our ancestors go all the way back to those first little tiny, tiny cells in the primordial ocean that figured out that if they shared genes with each other, they would have a better chance to survive. So we're sort of the manifestation of this amazing process of life and death and creation and destruction that's taken all kinds of forms over time. So if we reframe, this notion of what a human being is in the sense of a creature born of a living biosphere, and everything in the biosphere senses, and everything in the biosphere is surviving and growing and longs to thrive, and everything in the biosphere also dies and decays in time, then language becomes something that is simultaneously necessary and incomplete. Because through language, I am trying to communicate what I sense to you. And through language, you are trying to communicate what you sense to me. But the purpose of the communication is really important, right? Why am I communicating with you? Am I communicating to form a bond that allows us to collectively survive better together? Or am I communicating to try and conquer you, to take over your territory, to feed myself? And we can see it. Nature is in this dance all the time. And these images kind of show, I love this little image of the mouse on the frog. Like, that's such a beautiful example of creatures, cooperating in nature for mutual survival. But even, on the right-hand side, you see the tigers fighting with each other. You see the image of war. We are all of us, all species, all life, either in some level of communication to help each other survive and thrive, or in some level of communication to conquer each other. And this is the dance we go back and forth with all the time. So there's kind of three ways to talk about communication. We call kind of communication honest when I'm doing my best to represent my true intentions to you for the purpose of bonding, for the purpose of surviving. We call communication dishonest when I deliberately use my words in a way that's opposite of what's inside of me, that's opposite of my intention, right? And we all do it on some level, and we all hate it when it's done to us. Like, we rely so much on communication that it becomes criminal when someone's word is opposite their action. And we're kind of watching that play out a lot in the news these days. And then there's just a place where communication is sometimes confused and conflicted, because I may be speaking to you in a way that I think is true, but maybe I'm deceiving myself and I'm kind of confused. And all of this comes from my senses, your senses, and how we're using the word to share our understanding with each other. So if we want to look at it from the big perspective, this play of the human as a creature of an organic living biosphere wants to thrive, needs to survive. It's collective and individual both. And it's protecting against the moment of death until it's surrendered to death. And the key is, what am I doing with this little tiny moment that I have in this amazing experience of being able to sense the way I sense. And all of these issues of life and death, of surviving and thriving, come into play when we communicate with each other. Now, human beings do organize themselves into groups in order to survive better. And this is natural. So this is nature. And these are just some shots, some pictures of like land when you leave it alone and you don't try and build on it, right? Nature loves when you leave it alone to create systems where different plants will colonize different parts of the land. You know, so you'll see it's not a monoculture where everything is there all the time, but you've got certain key species that are sharing with each other. And, you know, the low grasses are taking up part of the land and the bushes taking up another part, or the wildflowers are kind of in their little community. So you'll find clumps of species living together. And plants put out root systems that continue to propagate themselves, you know, as above, so below. You know, and as human beings, honestly, we're just not that different from what the plants are doing. We organize ourselves into various ways, and one ways we organize ourselves as human beings is in what we call businesses. This will actually refer to Gurbani eventually, trust me, so just stay with me here. I know that it's like, why are we talking about businesses? But it does have a point. We organize ourselves in various ways. So we organize ourselves in what we call businesses or companies to collectively survive together. I work for a company, and that means I've identified and shared my talents and abilities with a collective of people, with a group of other people. And together, through our skills and agreements, we go into the world and we gather the natural prosperity that's there. And then we bring it back and we distribute that prosperity based on a pre-agreed system. We distribute the wealth in a pre-agreed way with each other. You know, it's fair, it's not fair, we like it, we don't like it, that's a different story. But this notion of a company actually is about a company of people. It's not a building or a logo, or it's about a company of people who are sharing an identity that gives them access to wealth in order to live and thrive and survive. Another way we survive is through family, and it's about the human beings with who I share genes with, right? My parents conceived a being, and I am the result of the intermixing of their genes, and I choose to intermix my genes with someone, and maybe we have offspring, and you know, there's the partner, the children, the parents, the siblings, the aunts, the uncles, the cousins. You know, different cultures have different lengths in terms of family relationships, so that in the Chinese culture you have and the same with Punjabi culture, you have really distinct names for this aunt or this uncle or that uncle. And then, you know, in other cultures, you know, it's the nuclear family that's the core, but what's beyond the nuclear family is not as strong. In either sense, you know, we have a bio community that we call family, and we have to live with them kind of whether we want to or not. Like, your biological family is not something you choose. Your biological family in some ways is is your original adaptation. You know, it's the biosphere where you first practice adapting in order to survive. So this is another way that we form ourselves to survive collectively. And then the third way is through culture. And culture is when different families come together kind of as a nation or as a people or as a tribe, and they'll have this shared understanding of how to survive together. And that shared understanding will include whatever the social hierarchy is, gender roles, if there's caste issues, value systems, philosophy. And then art and music become this amazing expression of what that culture values, because art and music can communicate the multidimensionality of the culture in a very succinct and complete way, right? So you can look at a picture and just know about the culture. You can listen to a song and learn about the culture far more than if you try and analyze it logically. So I have a bond with you not because I share genes with you, and not because you and I are in a sort of a company where we're providing together. We have a bond because we share the same cultural story and the values that come from that cultural story and the mythology that comes from that same cultural story and the expression in art and music that comes from that same cultural story. So all of these are very, very powerful bonds that we create or that we're given as human beings to survive, to just survive. But honestly, the most reverent, difficult, controversial, powerful bond of all is what we call religion or spirituality. And in a religious or spiritual community, I am not necessarily bonded with you because of my genetics, although I may be. I'm not necessarily bonded with you because we are performing the same function to receive nourishment, although that could also happen. And I'm not necessarily bonded with you because we have a shared value system as a nation or a culture or a people or a tribe, although that could happen. But I'm bonded with you because my understanding of the cosmos and my place in it, and your understanding of the cosmos and your place in it, comes from the same set of teachings and, or historical teacher. And that is probably the most powerful bond we share as human beings. When we organize ourselves into sets of people who agree to survive together based on the way they understand this mystery called life. So when we share this mystery called life, the understanding of the mystery of consciousness, of unfolding, of evolving, when we share that with each other, we have common stories or common explanations that we refer to. So Christians are Christians not actually necessarily by virtue of their values or their actions, right? They are Christian because they are identified with a historical figure that we call Jesus Christ. And they're identified with the New Testament and the Old Testament, which is a set of stories and teachings. And the Jewish people, they do actually have a shared genome based on a common ancestor named Abraham, but they also have an identification with the Torah and with the significance of certain historical events like Passover, right? So when we look into religion, we look into a common bond that we share with each other, a bond that relies on story and word, and how we navigate our bond with each other within that spiritual view, and how we relate collectively to all those communities that do not share the same story and sacred word, is probably the most defining characteristic of human society. Okay? So when it comes to translation of these sacred words and stories, right, we have to realize that I, as a translator, am an individual with a root system that gives me connection and support. Those roots extend to those with whom I am genetically connected. Those roots extend to those with whom I am culturally connected. And they extend to those with whom I share my skills for survival. And all of these layers, believe it or not, become the lens through which I understand the sacred word, the words that give my universe the most profound meaning I can find, and which bind me to others in the deepest bond that is possible. So when we approach translation, which is kind of the most precious organizational instructions for the human race, the first place I want to start is to say that it's not appropriate to think we know when we approach these sacred words, no matter what tradition you're from. So what you see in this picture in the upper left-hand corner is the Aramaic names of God from the Bible. It isn't that I know and therefore I'm going to translate and I am going to explain. It's that honestly at the core, the translator is probably one of the most desperate students that a set of teachings has, or one of the most questioning students. For a person to take a road where they intend on translating this primal spiritual word, you kind of have to be crazy on a certain level. You have to be longing for something really deep or some very profound healing. Some understanding. You're searching for something that you're not finding anywhere else and you want to go directly to the original text to understand. If you want to approach the word in such a direct way and in such a naked way and in such a provocative way. Because the act of translating a sacred teaching ultimately is an act of challenging the word and yourself. It is an act of transformation of how you understand that word. And it's an act of transformation about how you understand yourself. And then it's willing to put yourself on the line to that entire community that relies on that word. And you've got to have confidence to share what you've learned and the humility to recognize that you can never believe yourself to be the final authority. It requires profound humility and an almost egomaniac level of confidence in yourself to translate. It's like climbing a mountain that very few ever reach the top of. You've got to be insanely self-confident to try it and recognize how often you are going to get defeated in the process. So all of that I wanted to give as a framework as we go into this question of text, subtext, and language. And where I want to start is this question of how can we approach the word as translators? And I want to begin by looking at the ways that language is deficient in the context of text and subtext. So there are terms in linguistic theory known as text and subtext. And we think that a word means what it says in the dictionary. But the dictionary is only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to language. Words have meaning in multiple dimensions. First, they have meaning by what they identify. But the other area is that languages have maps of meaning encoded in them. And these maps are about how words relate to each other. The simplest example is, right, that you don't know what the word tall means unless you also have the concept of short as your reference. I can speak the word tall, but somewhere in the connectivity of the brain, when it comes to language and all the words you know, tall is relative to short, right? It's not that tall means something by itself. It's a comparison subconsciously, automatically between these concepts of tall and short. So there's no word that means anything in isolation. And so that's what gives this cartoon its humor, right? The bird says, I'm tall, and then this other bird comes along. Notice how there's absolutely no words in the second panel of the cartoon, and you totally get the joke. And you get the joke because tall, when you read the word tall, it's actually activating a matrix in which tall is defined in your mind. And the second panel doesn't need language at all. It just needs to play with that matrix of meaning that already exists inside of you because you know the language. And that's what gives, the cartoon its humor. It's playing in the way that language is mapped in your brain, and it only needs to provoke the connectivity of meaning inside of you to make you laugh. It doesn't need, you don't need it to say, and here comes a bird that's taller and showing the first bird that it's shorter and the first bird is embarrassed. You don't have to state that. It's all visible because of the matrix of meaning that exists in your mind all the time. Now, this actually gets very complicated when we talk about humans as sensory beings. The physical world, we can all agree on what a flower is, whether you say it's hua, which is Chinese, or ful, which is Punjabi, or fleur, which is French, or white, which is English. People from, or flower, flower, which is English, right? People from different cultures and languages can pretty much agree on what a flower is. But the meanings of colors and the emotions that things evoke are very different based on culture. And this is something I learned back in my undergraduate days when I was studying linguistic theory and Chinese and issues of translation. One of the best examples I have is this Chinese phrase, bai hua. It's Chinese for white flower. And of course, there is the English phrase, white flower. And that should be pretty easy to translate, right? Because, you know, white flower, there's a white flower, what's the big deal? But what if you're looking at poetry, okay? And why is poetry so effective? Poetry is effective because poetry also provokes and dances with the unspoken maps of meaning that we hold in our psyches when it comes to language. So just like the cartoon was playing with that unspoken map, poetry actually dances with that unspoken matrix in a really deep and profound way. The reason a poem will emotionally move you, but a computer software manual may not necessarily emotionally move you, right, is because the software manual is dealing with a very tangible reality, whereas poetry deliberately works with and provokes the unspoken subconscious connections that we have between language, image, feeling, meaning, and sense, and all of these intangibles. So when you look at a white flower, it's a white flower. When you have a line in Chinese poetry that says white flower, we have to ask ourselves, what does the word white mean on a poetic level to the Chinese? White is the color of mourning in China. It's the color of death. It's the color of sadness. Whereas white in English is the color of purity. It's the color of weddings. It's the color of virginity. So on a deep level that cannot be spoken and can only be shared among people with the same map of language in their subconscious, a white flower can either provoke joy or sadness, and that is something absolutely unique to that particular language. When you want to translate a line of poetry from Chinese into English, if you say white flower, you preserve the text, right? The text is the same, the image is the same, but you lose what's called the subtext, which is what is getting unconsciously, subconsciously provoked by a shared understanding of what things mean. If I just say white flower in English, I'm losing the whole subtext of sadness and grief. If I translate it as black flower, okay, well, yeah, sure, black is the color of mourning in Western society, but, you know, black flowers are pretty rare, so that would be confusing and would not make much sense, though the subtext is more visible. You might be able to convey the subtext that way, and you might not, but you lose the entire text along the way. So if we're going to translate poetry from such different languages with such different maps, we need to have the courage, and this is a courageous act. we need to have the courage to go into the subtext of the original and make the subtext visible in the language in which you are translating, okay? So what that would be in English is something like, if we're going to translate white flower, bai hua, into English, we would translate it as a flower cloaked in morning white. And now you have found a way to bridge the text and the subtext both across these two very unique languages. Where in Chinese, the sadness of that flower doesn't need to be expressed verbally. The poetry is relying on the subtext that people have access to in their psyche to evoke those feelings. But in English, you have to evoke that feeling verbally because the subtext of white is so different. Now, if we can understand subtext in the matrix of meaning through humor, and we understand the level of complexity when it comes to poetry, when it comes to the sacred word, this issue becomes even more important. And that's because there is a supertext in divine languages. The author or poet is trying to express a reality that's actually beyond concept, thought, and language. And like Gurbani, when you just translate from Gurmukhi, from a Gurmukhi English dictionary, you're losing many dimensions of meaning. You're losing the subtext and the supertext both, right? So mystics actually deliberately go to the space beyond language that is deficient to try and sense directly as much as they can sense. And then they come back and attempt to express it in words that are deficient. And Guru Nanak will say this in Japji all the time. I can't describe, what I'm trying to describe here, I don't have the words for. So there's a supertext when it comes to sacred meaning, and there's subtext, and you've got to deal with both. So the dictionary is the starting point, but it's not the final point when it comes to translation. So I'm going to spend the rest of the time just looking at one specific example in Gurbani when it comes to this, although I had like half a dozen to share, but it would take me probably 3 hours to do all of this. So let's kind of begin with Guru Nanak's Enlightenment experience. So, these days we have two different versions of Guru Nanak's Enlightenment experience. One says he sat under the river Bain for 3 days and then emerged. The other says he went into a forest and came back after 3 days. And I'm not going to debate the various merits of the story today. But what's important is that Guru Nanak gained access to and insight about the nature of the universe and the human being's place within it. And he expressed that insight through a symbol that had never been seen or heard before, the Ong Kaar symbol. But let's take a moment to look at this symbol first. Whoops. Hold on. Oh, no. Sorry. Okay, here we go. I skipped something. All right, and out of that symbol came the prayer Japji Sahib, and also the powerful phrase, there is no Hindu and there is no Muslim. Right, so Guru Nanak's first teachings are Ong Kaar, what we learn in Japji, there is no Hindu, there is no Muslim. Japji Sahib is a description of his enlightenment experience. And I want to step back and just say, okay, if you search the internet, the Ong Kaar symbol in the internet, here's what it looks like, right? And if we have the Ong Kaar symbol in a Gurmukhi font, a computer font, that's what it looks like. And the fairly well-known translation of Ong Kaar is, right, there is one God. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, here's a symbol Guru Nanak created after his enlightenment experience. Here's the English translation, there is one God. Is this correct? On the level of text, on a level of subtext, on a level of supertext. Okay, let's dig in. The origin of the concept there is one God actually dates back to ancient Egypt, and the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten, who ruled during the 18th dynasty of Egypt from about 1353 BCE to 1336 BCE. And I don't want to get into the complexities of Egyptian mythology, society, and politics. And I don't even have the expertise to do that. But what I can share is that, you know, Akhenaten had a revelation that the sun god Ra was actually the only one god whose actual name was Aten. And for thousands of years, the Egyptians had worshipped a pantheon of gods and goddesses, and there was a social hierarchy among these deities. But the notion of, like, there's only actually one god was a new one. And in the name of this new one god, Akhenaten, you know, abandoned the traditional capital city and built a new capital city. He left the names of the other gods off any new construction. He deliberately actually removed the names of the other gods from existing monuments and buildings. And this actually created a crisis within his country. And after his death, he became known as a heretic. So after Akhenaten's death, the empire gradually abandoned the cult of Aten and returned to their former pantheistic traditions. And in fact, at first, Akhenaten's name was, you know, despised. They hated this guy because he, you know, just tried to make such a huge, drastic change to society by saying that there was only one God. You know, God, gosh, how foolish can you be? Of course, there's lots of gods and goddesses. And eventually, he was left out of the official history of Egypt altogether, and it was only by accident that archaeologists even learned that this guy existed. So when we look back with historical records, this is the very first time that this notion of there is one God presents itself in history. And that's the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten saying, there's only one God and everyone else you've been worshiping all these years, centuries, generations, doesn't exist. The next time we hear about there is one God is this guy Abraham, who actually becomes simultaneously the common ancestor of our three major monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And it's pretty fascinating because when we look at it, you know, Abraham just wants a child. I mean, that's the story of Abraham. Oh, God, I want a son. And God says, okay, I'll give you a son. And his wife gets older and older and older and older, and she doesn't conceive and she doesn't conceive. She eventually gets embarrassed, gives Abraham her handmaiden. Abraham has sex with the handmaiden. There's a son born, but then his wife actually gets pregnant very late in life. And so now rather than one son, he's got two by two different women. And the handmaiden is sent off when the real son is born. And she wanders with her son in the desert, but God promises to protect her and her offspring. And then Isaac is Abraham's son, and at some point God says to Abraham, okay, I gave you your son, now you have to sacrifice him to me. And it's this interesting moment where, I mean, it's kind of, it's a moment of sort of pagan ritual giving way to something else, right? Because Abraham apparently doesn't have a problem killing his firstborn son if God asks. And there's a lot here. I won't go, I mean, we could do a whole seminar on this, but the key is the story just goes, he's a guy who wanted a son. And when he goes to sacrifice Isaac and God sends him a goat instead and stays his hand, he goes into this spiritual ecstasy, And out of Abraham's spiritual ecstasy is born the idea of this monotheistic God, and I'm only going to worship you, and I'm not going to worship anybody else, and you are the one true God. And like I said, he's just a guy who wants a son. But what happens is this notion of monotheism, of there is just one God, becomes a really powerful idea. So powerful that the Christians make sure that they can prove that Jesus Christ is related to Abraham. So powerful that the Muslims prove that Muhammad is connected to Abraham and eventually to Adam. So this story of Abraham wanting a son becomes this incredible seed that anyone who's kind of wanting to buy into this idea of there's only one God is actually taking the pains to prove through the Bible and through story that we're actually related to this guy. Like, we're literally his genetic offspring. So this is the name of the one God that Abraham's given, and no one was allowed to pronounce or say this name. No one's allowed to say it. Instead, the Jewish people would call this symbol Hashem, which means the name. And the symbol's referred to as the tetragrammaton, and please forgive me if I mispronounce it. And whenever it's seen, people don't pronounce it directly. They use the word Adonai, which means my master. And this is the origin. This is the origin of the Jewish faith, is this name of the one true God that nobody's allowed to say, and we just call the name. But what does it really mean that there is one God? Okay, what are we talking about? In the time when Judaism was born, their Semitic religions are polytheistic in nature. Okay, they're like the ancient Egyptians. They worship a bunch of gods and goddesses who are responsible for creation. And there's a statue on the right of the Canaanite goddess Asherah, who's the goddess of motherhood and fertility, who's the lady of the sea, is connected with Jerusalem and the Jordan River. You know, she's the one who rules there, right? The polytheistic religions of the area do not die out as the tribe of Abraham grows, because you have to be Jewish to learn about the faith. And frankly, you've got to be a Jewish man to learn about the faith. So it's not, Judaism is not ultimately a conquering, converting religion. It's just saying, yeah, there's one God, and that's what we're going to teach to our kids. And these other people are practicing their polytheistic religion, and we're not going to try and convert them, but we'll fight with them. And there's, you know, stories of the wars they have that God tells them to have in the Bible, which is fine. That's their faith, that's their tradition, right? But something happens, which is this guy comes along named Jesus Christ, and he's a Jewish reformer at the start. And Christianity has this notion of there is one God. And the Christians actually develop against the backdrop of the Roman Empire, which has a polytheistic society as well. And so there's this little Jewish sect that comes from this Jewish reformer, Jesus Christ. And one of Jesus's greatest reforms is he took this idea of the one God out of the tribal family. He left his tribe and said, this is a great idea, there is one God. I'm going to go tell people who aren't Jewish about it. And he began having followers and enemies, and after he dies, there's a group of people who are small who kind of keep it going. Like, okay, we're not allowed to be part of the Jewish faith, but we still believe in this idea of there is one God. And the key moment in Christian history is that the Romans start to really get annoyed with these people because they won't do the worship at the official gods and goddesses. They're not going to the temples and making the sacrifice. And the pressure builds and builds and builds and builds to the point where the Roman emperors start saying, worship our gods and goddesses or we're going to kill you. And the Christians start saying, fine, kill us. And this becomes like this amazing movement, because people start to see their courage, then they join them, then they're willing to die to not have to, they want to believe in the one God of Jesus Christ. They don't want to believe in, you know, the Roman gods and goddesses and have to pay all this money to the temples every time they go. And eventually the conflict becomes so great, and whether you look at it from a spiritual perspective, a supertext perspective, that Constantine saw the light and believed in one God, or whether you want to look at it from a subtext perspective, which is that Rome was getting into a high level of turmoil and Constantine needed to make peace with the Christians. The point is that in 340, oh, that should be 380 AD. I'm sorry, I wrote that wrong. In 380 AD, Christianity goes from being this sect into the official religion of the Roman Empire and completely wipes out the practice of the old gods and goddesses of Rome, and everyone's now got to worship Jesus and his connection to the one true God. As Christianity moves into Europe, with the weight of the Roman Empire behind it, so, you know, you've got within a generation or two, the wealth and power of the Roman Empire brings Christians into Europe, and there they begin to challenge the, you know, native traditions, which are also polytheistic: Celtic polytheism, German and Finnish paganism, Greek and Roman religions, Basque mythology. All of this slowly gets replaced by the one God that Jesus worshipped and died for. And then when Christianity moves into the New World, following Christopher Columbus, they're doing this. They do the same thing with the native tribes, right? So wherever Christianity goes, it's now moved into a, we have to save these people. They're wrong to worship all these gods and goddesses. We've got to get them connected with Jesus and the one true God. Then we look at Islam, and polytheism was also the predominant religion before Islam took hold in Arabia. And, you know, at the time of Muhammad, there's Arab polytheism, there's also Christianity and Judaism being practiced, but still the polytheism, the Arabian polytheism, was the predominant religion of the time. And this is, not a lot of people know this, but the Kaaba, sorry, I misspelled, I meant to correct that. The Kaaba in Mecca actually was originally a shrine for the gods and goddesses of this polytheistic system. So when all of Islam prays to Mecca 5 times a day, they're actually praying to a shrine that existed long before Muhammad came onto the scene. And we don't know how long. We don't know its origins. What we know is that at the time of Muhammad, the deities of these Arab polytheistic religions were there, and then Muhammad took it over and said, I'm getting rid of all these idols. If you keep praying to Mecca, but think about Allah instead of all these idols. And there's one, you know, story actually about when Muhammad died. There was a group of women who started to celebrate because they could go back to practicing their polytheistic religion. And they painted their hands with henna and danced. And there were some Islamic soldiers who heard about this, got offended, rode out and cut off the women's hands for celebrating that they could go back to the other way, to their old ways. So what there is one God in terms of supertext, right? Is that, hey, there's not all these gods and goddesses responsible for creation. There's just one God who's responsible for creation. But the subtext of there is one God is absolutely a subtext of that idea being picked up and used to get rid of all the people or change all the people who think that it's many gods and goddesses that create the reality. So all of this comes into play when we use the phrase there is one God this is the whole linguistic historical lineage that is subconsciously mapped onto that phrase. Okay, so I just want to look at this picture for a second. So we have Abraham and Hashem, the name. We've got, Abraham kind of being willing to sacrifice his only son, his son, and God spares him and gives him the name. Then we have Jesus Christ, who's considered the Word made flesh. So the word that no one can speak becomes flesh in Jesus, and he gets sacrificed the way that Isaac wasn't, and he's proclaimed as the only son of the one true God. And then you have Muhammad, where image and name become one. You're not allowed to represent Muhammad pictorially. You can only represent him with the word. And so, here you've got kind of the culmination of this journey in Muhammad, where there is no God but Muhammad, Allah, and Muhammad is his, last prophet, his final prophet. And that's how a guy who prays for a son and has a supertext awakening about one God becomes, through a couple, few thousand years, several thousand years, the predominant theistic belief system of the modern world. I mean, this is simplistic, but we only have so much time. Okay. So when we get to the British Raj, and remember, we form ourselves in companies to survive, right? The British East India Tea Company annexes Punjab in 1849. And Max Arthur McAuliffe is born in 1841, and he's the first English-speaking Sikh historian. So and the British Raj, for me, I'd like to think of it as a reincarnation of the Roman Empire, right? Because Rome spreads out, and Christianity is one of the main ways it spreads out, and then, the British kind of go through their Reformation, and they're Protestants, but they take the same road. They start using their wealth to conquer imperialism. We've got to convert, we've got to save the world, we've got to make ourselves rich. I mean, whatever it all is, it's all of it together, right? But there is no real need for the Sikhs to communicate who they are, to communicate their identity in English until this time in the mid to late 19th centuries, when the East India Tea Company annexes Punjab. So I want to just show the resemblance, right? Ik Onkar Satnam. There is one God. Truth is his name. And then here's the Hebrew word for God, the one God whose name we cannot speak, and Hashem, the name. So notice the resemblance between these two supertexts and subtexts, though the text is different. So the question becomes, did Guru Nanak say anything new? Right, so up until the time of Guru Nanak, across the whole globe, you have this slow but inexorable replacement of the old polytheistic systems with the monotheism that is foreshadowed by the heretic Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten and systematized by this odd progression of a Jewish tribe's isolated belief system, a Jewish reformer whose work becomes a new religion adopted by non-Jews and eventually the Roman Empire, and lastly, a shepherd in Arabia who resonates with the whole one God idea but gives his own take on it, and then goes out and conquers Arabia, liberating the Kaaba from the old deities in the name of Allah. So whether we are conscious of it or not, when we use a phrase like there is one God, we are evoking a very specific religious, historical, and cultural process. And it's not something we can consciously describe, unless you're a geek like me who loves to dig into this stuff, right? But we can subconsciously feel it. So it stands to reason that as the Sikhs and the British begin their new relationship, the British could only really understand Guru Nanak according to the framework that they brought with them. And as the Punjab became absorbed by the British Empire, the subtext of Gurbani took on the color of this vast history of monotheism. So what we have to ask ourselves is this: when Guru Nanak had his enlightenment experience and brought forth this new spiritual symbol, was he simply restating what Akhenaten had said and what Abraham had said, what Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad had said? And if not, then what is the supertext and what is the subtext of Ong Kaar that we need to make visible in English? Okay, here we go. And I'm probably going to go over my hour a little bit, but I hope you're with me and that you're enjoying this. All right. The first thing we have to do is ask ourselves, look at the text. Here's the text of Ong Kaar. This is how Ong Kaar is commonly displayed in graphics on the internet, in our Gurmukhi fonts, and even in our nitnames. And we have come to accept that this is the text when it comes to the symbol Ong Kaar. However, when we look at antique handwritten Siri Guru Granth Sahibs, we notice something different, and I call this the flourish of the Kaar. The Ong Kaar has a very distinct flourish that goes into the space. It goes into the space of the page way beyond the flourish we see in our artwork and texts today. Okay? And this is kind of an important discovery that Dr. Harbhajan shared with me recently, is that the Gurus themselves would use the Ong Kaar symbol as their signature in their hukamnamas to the Sangat. And here I'm going to show two examples of how the Ong Kaar was written, and this is by Guru Hargobind Ji, and this is his Ong Kaar, and you can see it just goes, you know, across the top of the page. It has all this space and expression. And here's Guru Tegh Bahadur's Ong Kaar, which I love this Ong Kaar. It's so beautiful. The one is so elegant and vast, and the Kaar, that flourish of the Kaar, goes like to the end of the page, and just to show that it's not stopping at the end of the page somewhere, it comes back. It's such an amazingly vast, beautiful flourish. So one thing we've got to understand when it comes to text is that with the invention of the printing press, and now with the technological needs of computer fonts, the flourish of the Kaar has gotten progressively smaller. The text is being altered by technology. But this flourish is not just ornamentation, it is an incredibly important part of the Ong Kaar symbol. So let's look closely at it, what we've got, right? In the Ong Kaar symbol, the symbol for one is the start of it. And from that numeral, yes, it's fair to say that Ong Kaar is referring to oneness of some kind. And that's valid. It's referring to some kind of oneness, one something. But the rest of the symbol has a lot of different dimensions at play. So Ura is the first letter of the Gurmukhi alphabet, and it's the initiation of sound, of language, of vibration. The Sanskrit syllable Om is rendered in Gurmukhi below, and you know, it's possible that Guru Nanak was aware of Om and playing with the subtext of Om, which was known by the people of his day, like challenging them. You know, you've been relating to Om, to the void, to the stillness, but let me take you somewhere new. But the flourish that we pronounce Kaar is the mystery, because it moves from stillness into action, from the void of Om into the sound of Ura, into the creativity of Om, and the result is Kaar, creation, a wave of sound from the one that creates form and has no end. And this is why the flourish is so important. It implies that the one is in the creation, creating through the creation, creating through vibration, through sound, that you can't separate creator and creature. There is a creator, there is a creature, but they're not separate from each other, and there's a play to creation that we're part of, that we can experience. So the whole notion of oneness is definitely contained within the Ong Kaar symbol, but there's much more to it. There's one consciousness, there's one light, and it creates the creation, and it's within the creation, and that is what that symbol is conveying. And so here's the way that I've poetically rendered Ong Kaar in the Gurmukhi translation work that, has been a blessing to do. One spirit beyond moves within the creation, coordinating, consolidating, continually creating. And this is an attempt then to honor the text of the Gurmukhi and to make both the subtext and the supertext of the Ong Kaar symbol visible in English when English has no concept and no map of what Guru Nanak experienced and expressed after his Enlightenment experience. So there is one God. There's a supertext of monotheism in that line that replaces polytheism, right? And the subtext of it is that the supertext is, hey, we've got this new understanding that creation is not a bunch of gods and goddesses, it's just one power. But the social subtext is all the people who practice polytheism are wrong, and we've got to change their mind. But when it comes to Guru Nanak, there is one light, and it works through the creation. And that's the supertext that he entered into through his mystical experience. And the subtext becomes 250 years of social reform, where the Sikh gurus begin challenging the caste system. They challenge gender inequality and religious discrimination, because the one light is in everybody. So if that's true, why are women inferior? If that's true, why are we condemning groups of people to lives of slavery and ignorance? And that's how the text and the supertext and the subtext of Ong Kaar are actually quite different from the English phrase, there is one God, though there is a place where the two of them meet, and it meets in the notion of oneness. Now, whether Guru Nanak's insight is new or actually sort of the original spiritual truth that goes back beyond the mists of history is a conversation for another day. But that's one way to understand this issue of text, subtext, and supertext when it comes to translating Gurbani. Okay, it looks like I'm going to finish just in time here. So here's what we didn't have time for. I had examples for Satanam, Nam Simran, Ad Sach, Jugat Sach, Habe Sach, Nanak Hosi Be Sach from Sukhmani, and this beautiful line from Guru Amar Das, Gurmukh Bani Brahm Hai, Shabad Malava Hui. I wanted to do the same process with all these phrases, but that would be 3 hours, and I've been blessed to get 1 hour with CRI. So that is the conclusion of my presentation, and I'm grateful to share these thoughts with you. And now I'm willing to listen to your questions and see where we go.
Thank you for that excellent presentation, Benji. This was personally enlightening for me. We have had a few questions about the different religions that you've mentioned. Govinder Singh Viji is curious about Christianity and their belief in the Trinity, and how that intersects with this concept of one God. And you might not be the expert for this, but perhaps
no, I was raised a good Catholic, 12 years of nuns. I think I can speak to this pretty decently. Okay. Although I'm sure the Jesuit priests can speak to it much better than I can. The concept of the Trinity is something that gets sort of enunciated at the Nicene Council in 380 AD, or I can't remember exactly when it happens, but when Constantine, basically there's and anyone who saw the movie The Da Vinci Code knows this, right? So this isn't secret anymore. But during the time of Constantine, there were lots of people who related to the historical figure of Jesus and certain writings that were considered his teachings, but they were a very diverse group of people. And so the question of what Christianity was had to be sort of hammered out and defined before Constantine could turn around and say, you guys are the official religion of an empire, right? So the Christians got together and just debated and debated and debated and debated. And out of that debate came this idea that Jesus was the Word made flesh. So there's a need in Christianity to both have connection with Abraham and separation from Judaism. And it's a tricky process, right? So because Jesus was obviously born Jewish, he was clearly kind of a reformer of his day, and then something else grows out of that. So what the theology that developed through the Nicene Council was that there's God in three aspects. There's they hold on to the notion of the one God whose name cannot be spoken, Adonai, Hashem, right? And that's the one consciousness that unites everybody. There are some things I'd like to say, but I'm not sure that I want them to be recorded, so I don't think I'm not gonna say everything I think about this, and I just want you all to know that. I think, well, no, I guess I am gonna say it, and with all due respect to Christianity, it's possible that the Roman Empire was gonna have a hard time letting go of all their gods and goddesses, and that may have played into support of the idea that Jesus was divine. But among the original Christians, it wasn't a given that Jesus was divine. And in fact, up until the Middle Ages and the Crusades, there were still groups, the Gnostic Christians, who, said Jesus was human. We're all sons of God. We're all daughters of God. He was human like we were. So that debate existed, but the official version that came out of the Nicene Council is that Jesus was divine. Was more than human. And the way that got justified was, well, there is this word, the Hashem, the name, and in this one particular instance, the name came into form briefly for this one sacrifice to show us the way, and the name will never come into form again. And, this was the mercy of God and the compassion of the Creator so that we could learn the proper way to find God and be forgiven for our sins, okay? So those are two aspects of the Trinity. And in the spiritual side of it, to honor the supertext of Christianity, there's resonance between Abraham being willing to sacrifice Isaac and Hashem being willing to sacrifice his only son. The only, Mary's got to be a virgin, right? It's a mystical conception. All of these things come out of this idea that Jesus is actually a God on the earth. He's a divine being on the earth, just this one time, through Hashem sending his word into form to create this path of salvation for the world. So if Hashem is a nameless God, and Jesus just came for one incarnation, one round of being the Word made flesh, then there's got to be some way that a human being today can feel connected to the journey. And that's the notion of the Holy Spirit. The notion of the Holy Spirit is that, God sent his only son briefly to the world. God took form in flesh very briefly for a specific historical sacrifice that resonates back to Isaac and Abraham. But I haven't abandoned you. I've left you the essence of my spirit, which you can feel when you come together in prayer. And the first example of the Holy Spirit is, after the death of Christ. I think it's Pentecost, I want to say, but again, the Jesuit priests would know far better than I would, that there's like the resurrection has happened, and all of a sudden the apostles are bestowed the gift of tongues. In other words, they can go out and start speaking many languages in order to share this story. It's symbolically the moment where the idea of Hashem, the name, the unspoken one God, really literally transfers from a specific genealogical, tribal belief to a belief that's being given divine permission to go to every culture and language in the world. It's a huge breaking of the seal, so to speak. And it's by the Holy Spirit, which is this third aspect of the triangle, that Christians today are empowered to take the word into any language, to take the word into any culture, to spread the good news to anybody, because Jesus made this profound sacrifice, and it's up to them to make sure that everyone knows about it and has a chance to be redeemed. So that's my 12 years of Catholic upbringing talking about the Trinity.
Awesome, thank you. I personally have a question of how do we begin to make the subtext clear for ourselves as we're translating?
Well, that's the $65 million question, right? And it's not just subtext, it's supertext. If you just go to subtext, you don't have the whole story, right? You've got to understand, like when the Siri Singh Sub was working with me on translating Japji, one thing he said was, you've got, Guru Nanak was a master of sound. You've got to go to the cosmology and translate from there. So there's two levels of work to do. And one level is, what is the cosmology of Gurbani? We've mapped terms into English, and we've lost the Gurmukhi map, the cosmological map of Gurmukhi, because we think about Gurmukhi in English terms, and the English has a different cosmology than Gurbani does. So that's another conversation. Is about, you want to start to look at how Gurbani refers to each other, right? That's how we discover the supertext or understand the supertext. Just like long and short refer to each other, all these words, jot, nam, man, amrit, had, ram, they all have meanings in relationship to each other, and we need to understand what those words are and what that unique map is. So that's from going to the text itself. Before you go to the subtext or the supertext, go to the text. And one of the issues that's very real is that even the text of the Sri Guru Granth Sahib that we have today is not what it was at the time of the Gurus. Because when Guru Gobind Singh Ji wrote and dictated the Guru Granth Sahib, there were no spaces between the words. There were line breaks, but there were no spaces. So, it's not that there's anything wrong or right. It's not that. But it's about understanding that it's okay to ask the question, what's the original text? Just like we did with Ong Kaar and what it gave us. It's okay to say, this is what we have today by virtue of technology. Is there anything in the antique texts that can help us understand what we have today better? Not as a criticism, but just as a comparison. And once you understand the supertext, then the subtext will become clearer. And you understand subtext through story, and so one of the examples I was going to give that I didn't have time to is that, like when we look, and this is, part of the, how do we understand the subtext? Well, a lot of times you understand it through story and through culture. Ad Sach Jagat Sach Habe Sach Nanak Hosi Be Sach is the 17th shlok of Sukhmani Sahib. The story goes that Guru Arjan and Baba Siddhi Chand were meeting, and Guru Arjan was having difficulty with Sukhmani, and he asked Baba Siddhi Chand to give the next line so he could keep going. And at first Baba Siddhi Chand didn't want to do it. He said, "This shabad is for you people. I don't write shabad. I don't channel Bani, But when pressed, what Baba Siddhi Chand did was he took the seal of the Mol Mantra, Ad Sach Jagat Sach is the seal of the Mol Mantra. He took that seal and he just amplified it, right? So the difference between the seal of the Mol Mantra and the 17th shlok of Sukhmani is emphatic. From the beginning this truth was true, all through time and space it's true. It's definitely true right now. It will absolutely be true for all eternity. Now, that story could be your subtext for that shlok, And in the subtext, it's an inclusion of Baba Siddhi Chand in the shabad. It gives validity to the udasis. It does a lot of things. And it says that, yeah, even the gurus got stuck sometimes. And if you get stuck, if this Ad Sach Jagat Sach Habe Sach Nanak Hosi Be Sach helped Guru Arjan, why can't it help you when you feel stuck? Chant it. But that's very provocative subtext for today, right? Because today, well, the Udasis are Hindu, they're not part of us. The gurus would never ask Baba Siddhi Chand for help. So with the British Raj came in an era of rationalization, of trying to rationally dissect our stories. And so, well, we should throw away that story. It doesn't rationally hold up. And once you throw away that story, you lose the subtext of that shlok. So, my joke is that, translating is an exciting and dangerous career. And I encourage anyone who wants to delve into these waters to watch the movie Luther, which is about when Martin Luther translated the Bible into German. When you dive into the primal word that organizes a global community in the highest relationship possible, it's very, very powerful issues come up. So the way to do it is to be courageous, to be compassionate, to be curious, to be fearless, to be humble, and to trust that Guru Dev exists. Guru Gobind Singh said there are three aspects of the Guru: the historical Guru, the Shabad, and Guru Dev, the transparent energy. And to let Guru Dev guide your journey, to meditate and have a conscious relationship with Guru Dev to guide your journey, so that, because there's a million places you can get trapped along the way, and the Guru's the only one who can really show you.
Awesome. We have one last question. I think we're about to wrap up. If you can just briefly answer this question from Govinder Singh, talking about how Gospels and Sakhis are a subtext, they're storytelling. How do you personally feel about using Sakhis from the Guru's time all the way to, the contemporary Sikh period, if they're not really that reliable,
Well, here's what I would offer.
Mm-hmm.
The Sakhis you have are important, and you don't want to lose them. It's very easy to say, okay, we're 21st century Sikh scholars, we've got all these other tools we can understand Gurbani with, let's tear apart the grammar, let's do this, let's do that. But there's also a reality that the British Raj had a huge influence on how Sikhs understood themselves in the context of the English language. And your only tools to separate kind of these conflicting forces is your old stories. And you've got to ask yourself, what did the Sakis say? What potentially is subtext that got grafted onto us because this is how the British think, but not necessarily what the cosmology of Gurbani is? You've got to kind of adopt an approach that to not be afraid of the Sakis, to not exclude them, to let them, they still exist today because they have something important to say. And what is it that's important that they're saying? And to not just throw them away because we've adopted a rationalist approach, when Guru Nanak wasn't a rationalist. He was a mystic and a poet. So how do we enter into the realm of the mystic and the poet? And the other thing is, you know, there are plenty. One of the most incredible things that I love about Sikh history is that every time something happened that was important, somebody built a Gurdwara, right? Somebody built a Gurdwara. So whenever something truly miraculous or truly incredible or truly profound happened, the people of that community were inspired to create a physical representation. So your history is not just in the Sakis that are preserved. Your history is in the physical structure of what people did when those amazing things happened. And the tragedy of partition is that the majority of Sikh history takes place in the Pakistani side of Punjab. And what we're losing there in terms of memory is huge. So if you want to understand your memory, go to all the texts that existed. Go to all the stories that existed. Go to all the monuments that existed. And look to the supertext of Gurbani and Gurudev to guide you. And if you find these scholarly tools helpful, use them, but don't make the dictionary your guru. Don't make the grammar your guru. Don't make the rational process your guru. Let the guru be your guru. And don't be afraid to listen to a nitnam from 300 years ago or that challenges what the nitnam is today, not because you're trying to overthrow something, but because you want to know why it was valuable then. And then say, does it still have value today? And that's how I would answer that question.
Awesome. Well, thank you for letting me ask questions, and my deepest apologies to those whose questions weren't addressed due to time constraints. We are going to wrap up. You're more than welcome to ask these questions on our Twitter handle or the Facebook page, and we'll be sure to post our replies. Please be reminded that these webinars are provided for free, but there is a cost associated with these technologies and administration of the webinars. If you feel like you've benefited from this particular webinar or others in the past, please consider making a donation to Sikri or becoming a webinar sponsor. More details can be obtained in the follow-up email you will receive or by emailing info@sikri.org. A reminder to everyone, please wait a few seconds for the link to appear on the follow-up survey. Your feedback is extremely important to Sikh Research Institute, and we appreciate your time. And as I end this wonderful webinar on the behalf of Sikri, I would like to thank our presenter, Ong Kaar Kaur Khalsa, and our e-Sangha today for spending your weekend with us, talking about and reflecting on how we can build a deeper relationship with the Guru through translation, and what we need as we begin to think about how we translate Gurbani into many other languages. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of this.